All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Project Arise workshop, Biliteracy Instruction Part 1, featuring our friends at the San Diego County Office of Education. We're so glad you're here. Just as a reminder, Project Arise offers free professional learning for educators across the state in the form of free online courses, workshops such as this one, and also a community of practice. So we are so glad you're here, and I'm going to turn it over to Melanie from San Diego.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Melanie Stone, and I'm an ELA coordinator for Project Arise. I want to go ahead and I'll have my colleague introduce herself in just a minute. But before I do that, I was wondering if you can do a quick favor for me and let us know who is in the room. And you can let us know by on your phone or on your computer if you open up another tab. If you type in menti.com, that's menti.com, and then you enter the code, which is 87279393. You can select who you are. If you're an elementary teacher, a secondary teacher, administration from a county office, or other. That would really help us tailor the presentation to whoever is here and give you some insights based on your position. So I'm going to go ahead and see who is here. Terrific. We've got a good spread of elementary teachers and administration. Thank you, county office, for being here. Terrific. All right. We know all of you have had a long day, either with students, teachers, parents, and so we thank you for coming and joining us today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to my friend Monica.
Hi, everyone. I'm Monica Aguirre, and as we begin the session, sorry, I started to share and I realized I'm not being a very good multitasker, but I guess none of us are if we're honest about it. Let me see. There we go. Oops. Okay, finally. So Melanie and I will be focusing on biliteracy today. I'm bilingual in Spanish, and we're going to be honing in primarily on Spanish with some additional recommendations for other languages. But as we go through, we just want you to bear that part in mind. Let's go ahead and move to our first slide. Okay, there we go. Ready?
All right. Yeah. So we are talking about a couple of things when we're talking about multilingual learners, and we want to highlight a few things to plant some seeds as far as where education is going in the next couple of years. So just to highlight, almost 60% of California's PK and TK students and 40% of California's K through 12th graders in public schools speak a language other than English at home. So the reason why we highlight both of those statistics is that there is a definite trend in education where even if you're in high school, a high school teacher teaching seniors or what have you, I just saw that. I'm going to pause for a minute and give you the slide deck. Here you go. Thank you. There you go. We are going to be teaching students who have background in multiple language, and that's really the bottom line. And those group of students who have that home language other than English, it's growing. And in fact, will continue to grow. English language learners in California constitute a little bit over 19% of the total enrollment in California. And 81.9 of those English language learners primarily speak Spanish. And so for that reason, many of our examples are in Spanish to highlight that statistic, knowing that, yes, of course, there are other languages in our classrooms, and we'll give you some tools to address that as well.
So most of the English learners in the state are actually in SEI, Structured English Immersion programs, where the focus is on developing a high proficiency in English. Today, we're going to highlight Biliteracy program, where we're focused on developing high proficiency in both languages. The presentation today will be in English, so it's accessible to everyone. But as we go through, we'll highlight strategies in both languages. Spanish language development is the highlight. And so I just want to share with you some of our guiding documents. You have access to these in the PDF that Melanie shared with you, the Common Core Standards in Espanol. Additionally, teachers may use California SLD standards, Spanish language development. And as we go through, we'll highlight opportunities for both Spanish language development called out as SLD, and it's comparable to integrated ELD, with it being more content heavy, as well as opportunities for designated SLD, which is comparable to designated ELD, where we really think about how Spanish works through differentiated targeted instruction, and it's more language heavy.
So we're pulling this quote, which will guide our conversation today. And that is, we can't measure our instructional success by how well our top students are doing. Instead, we measure our success by how well our least resourced students are doing. It's no secret that multilingual learners are the lowest performing group of students in terms of literacy proficiency. And so it's our job to make sure that we are incorporating instructional tweaks that will support students who are learning 2 or more languages. So what we'd like you to do in the chat, if you could, is we would like to think about the learners, we would like you to think about the learners who are in your class or at your site this year. And if you could just process and think for a moment, how do you identify their specific needs? So how do you glean information about the students who are entering your sites or classrooms about their language development? How do you support them? And what strategies do you use that are most effective? So it's a loaded couple of questions for sure, but if you'd like to address any one of those, we welcome you to do that in the chat. And we also know that you'll have lots of answers to this question by the end of the presentation as well, so we can move forward.
So in the next few set of slides, we're going to engage in an activity looking at implementing the science of reading for multilingual learners, considering the brain research. And Melanie and I, through a lot of research, our references are listed below, have developed 5 guiding questions that will drive this presentation today, but also the next part, where we're thinking about, okay, so how do we meet their needs? The first consideration is, how do we activate and build background knowledge? The next is, how do we integrate language development, whether it's in English or in the target language, with differentiated scaffolds in context to ensure meaning making? The next question is, how do we embed oral language development opportunities strategically? And how do we leverage home language as an asset and transfer language skills through cross-language connections? And how do we incorporate safe and affirming, culturally and linguistically sustaining practices and content? Today, Melanie and I are going to hone in most heavily on activating and building background knowledge strategies and leveraging their home language as an asset. And we'll lay the groundwork for bridging through cross-language connections. Oh, before I move on, the one thing I want to add as well is you'll notice that these are color coded. And so throughout the presentation, whenever we're talking about activating and building background knowledge today, it will be highlighted in blue. And whenever we are honing in on home language as an asset, it will be green. You'll see that we've used this image of um, sort of this woven tapestry, because the reality is that we can rarely hit upon one without hitting on two or three or even four others. And so you'll notice that the color coding will continue throughout.
So for the bilingual brain research application, the work that we are doing and the suggestions that we're offering as far as instructional tweaks that you can implement in your classroom is they are all based on bilingual brain research. And there are a couple of pillars that we are going to highlight for you that you will see the strategies will elevate, and there will be that beautiful translation between the research to classroom practice. So the first one is the multilingual learner's brain uses home language to including phonemic awareness and other foundational literacy skills to make connections, to comprehend and apply new information, to acquire that target language. So there's always this comparison between what the students already know in their home language and where it fits in terms of acquiring that new home language. The second is the brain is a meaning-making, seeking organ, and we as educators must explicitly provide context for our students. And so any skills and practice that is done in isolation makes it extremely difficult for students, well, really all students, but particularly multilingual learners, to make connections between what they already know and the new information. So their brains are relying heavily on meaning-making experiences. In addition, those meaning-making experiences are also relied on developing proficiency in oral language. So there's a direct connection between what's in the brain and what gets expressed out in oral language. And then finally, it's critical that we support our multilingual learners to do a couple of things in the process of acquiring a new language. One is that we're connecting speech to the visual representation of language to the word's meaning. And if one piece of that flow is left out, the student's brain has a hard time figuring out if it's a connection that they could make or if it's new information. And so it's critical to include all components in that process.
We have an activity for you where we are going to introduce the first strategy, which is a predict then react activity, which you can use in your classroom. Melanie and I based this off of the research of Dr. David Sousa, and the book is called How the ELL Brain Learns. And so we're going to activate prior knowledge by asking you to grab the copy of the sheet on the bit.ly, which Melanie put in the chat, make a copy of the document, and we're going to give you a couple of minutes to make some predictions. So the way the activity works is that you'll have students make predictions on the left, And then as you give them the answers, the information, they react to it on the right. So I'll go through that as we're giving you the information, but we want to begin by giving you a couple of minutes to get your sheet ready and make your predictions. Okay, let's move on. Melanie, if you want to start with the first question.
Essentially, what would happen in the classroom when you translate this activity is you would have students, just like you all did, make predictions. And then as you go through and reveal the answers, students would have either conversations or they would write down reactions, but they would respond in some way to the new information. Today, to save us some time, we're going to go through the answers, and you are welcome, if you have a reaction, you are welcome to throw it in the chat, and or you can just react in awe on your own. All right, so here's the first question. Does age impact a person's ability to learn a new language? And the answer to that is yes. Acquiring language within the language-specific areas of the brain pretty much diminishes between the ages of 14 and 17. So what does that mean for our students? If we're teaching high school or middle school, we have students who come to us with yet another barrier in learning the target language. And so it is critical for teachers to create those bridges to facilitate that acquisition despite the student's age. Learning a new language recruits brain regions that generally they're not generally involved in home language acquisition. And so we really have to make those connections for students in the activities that we provide and the supports that we're providing as well. And then finally, a higher level of proficiency in a study done by Bleakley and Chin was reached at rates, higher rates when students are between 1 and 5 years of age. And then those who were 9 years of age, their proficiency rates dropped significantly. So really that critical time to learn a new language is age 1 through 5. And typically our students come to us after that. And so we wanted to plant that seed and how critical it is to be strategic in your planning for just a few instructional tweaks that you can make to help facilitate this acquisition.
And so as we started to tell you, students would respond to the information in the right column. So if there was anything that Melanie shared that was really amazing to you, that you could react to it on the other side, or if you already knew that, you can even write, I already knew that. Okay, the next question is, are language and reading processed in the same way by the monolingual and bilingual brain? And this happens to be a trick question because yes, both process individual languages in fundamentally similar ways. When speaking one language, there is increased brain activity in the brain's left hemisphere language regions, and skilled readers have a highly developed left hemisphere. But it's no, because when bilinguals are switching between languages, there is an increase in brain activity in both sides of the brain. And this is why we keep going back to this idea that it's so important to support students in comparing and making connections between what they know in their home language and the target language. Because when we do that, that's when we can, in some ways, even surpass those statistics that show that after 9 years of age, it's so much more difficult to acquire a second language.
So the next question was, what specific instructional methods and strategies alter brain pathways? And that's literally what we're doing as teachers. We are changing our students' brains. And through these strategies, we will help better support learning for multilingual learners. We're not going to have you share out, but we're going to plant some seeds. And then we're challenging you to make some connections as we share some strategic planning tools for you to make connections between what would best support your multilingual learners, what curriculum do you have, and what is the research out there? And let's weave that through these specific research topics. So the first is that we absolutely need to activate and build background knowledge. That's not new information for us in the classroom, but it is something that we need to be strategic about when planning, because sometimes our curriculum doesn't necessarily lay it out for us, but there are certainly some things that we can do that don't take a lot of prep, don't take a lot of planning, but are critical for activating and building that background knowledge. The next is we're going to suggest that you integrate language development with differentiated scaffolds. So through these differentiated scaffolds, it's going to facilitate meaning making and give students the language that they're going to need to participate in the discussion. And we all know how critical oral language development is. So by offering these strategic scaffolds, we're giving an invitation for students to participate no matter what their language level is. We are suggesting to plan to incorporate skills to practice in context, like I mentioned before. Isolation does not support the brain research. However, practice in context helps students make those critical connections and identify patterns to ensure comprehension. Making sure to embed opportunities for oral language development with differentiated scaffolds to support students at all proficiency levels. So that's emerging, expanding, and bridging. Assessing home literacy and language skills, and leverage assets to support cross-language connections. So in thinking about what information are you going to glean from students in their home language, and how do you go about doing that? And then finally, incorporating safe and affirming, culturally and linguistically sustaining practices will also provide a welcoming environment for students to participate, feel seen, and feel encouraged to take chances.
So we wanted to sort of take a step back and show you how what we're talking about is around the science of reading. And we begin with the 2000 National Reading Panel, where they established that we needed 5 components of the literacy block, including phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, all with comprehension really remaining at the forefront. And we realized very quickly that this research excluded the needs of multilingual learners. And so at the 2006 panel that included the work of Tim Shanahan, who really informs a lot of what we do for multilingual learners, they affirmed the National Literacy Panel and reported that instruction for multilingual learners must be adjusted to support deep transfer of language skills through home language skills and proficiency being leveraged as an asset, differentiation, opportunities for practice and feedback, effective instructional strategies in context, oral language development, cross-linguistic connections and transfer. And you'll notice that many of the colors that we have incorporated into our own guiding questions are actually reflected in the work of the 2006 panel. In Read Naturally, came back to the original findings of the 5 components of the literacy block and acknowledge that content knowledge is important for all students. And I think it really highlights that importance of meaning making and ensuring comprehension, as well as the importance of oral language development for all students. And so one of the statistics that Melanie and I often look to is that in many classrooms, teachers are doing the talking 75 to 85% of the time. And so the need to really flip that and ensure that students are practicing the new language, the new vocabulary, that they have the opportunity to really make sense of what they're learning and they're able to verbalize.
So let's talk a little bit about Scarborough's rope. We're going to view it in a certain context, layering in the 5 guiding questions to support as well. So most of us have seen Scarborough's rope, and it's critical to understand reading comprehension. Just this idea that the rope strands on the bottom contribute to that decoding skill that's critical for kids to be able to say the words that are on the page. The language comprehension composes so many different things. Those are the upper strands of Scarborough's rope. And then when those 2 types of skills are woven together, skilled reading then emerges. So where do the 5 guiding questions that we presented to you, where do they fall in with Scarborough's rope? And we would love to highlight that blue circle there in the middle, which is actually very critical to ensure that students are practicing these skills in a way where they are making connections between the reading, writing, speaking, listening. If students are only, let's say, listening to vocabulary without speaking the words and writing them on the page, there are some critical components that are lacking for students to then build on and extend and make connections between all of those 4 language domains, which really enable that skilled reading. So we wanted to highlight that piece, how with every single rope in that Scarborough's rope, those 4 language domains need to be incorporated. For the 5 guiding questions, as we were going through them, we noticed there is a lot of connection between what the brain research says for dual language students and Scarborough's Row. So for that decoding piece, you've noticed that purple meaning making and building home language connections, incorporating those and being very intentional about when you are presenting decoding activities, making sure that once the word is read, you are then attaching perhaps a visual cue to ensure that students know what that word means when they blended it. Also, providing some context for students in the form of a cognate, in the form of a phonemic marker, and comparing and contrasting home language to English really helps students identify their skills, leverage their understanding of language, and then build on that new language with confidence too. For the language comprehension piece, one of the 5 guiding questions that we offer is that intentional planning of oral language development. And of course, all oral language development is critical to build language comprehension. And then finally, we have that reading comprehension is offering teachers this idea that there is a role and a responsibility as an educator to connect what the context is to the reading comprehension piece. So that's providing differentiated scaffolds. That's providing visual cues. That's providing words embedded in sentences, and giving kids time to process the meaning and the decoding piece together. So just real quick, Monica, to highlight, it's the reason why we have this slide up there is you can see Scarborough's Rope alone isn't enough. And we really need these opportunities to intentionally plan for, number one, the 4 language domains, but also that meaning piece is critical. Oral language is critical for language comprehension, and building home language connections as well. So strategically planning for language development will embed support throughout instruction for all students.
Okay. Thank you, Melanie. And so we want to begin to take a deeper dive in how to activate and build background knowledge. So we begin with, why is it important? And we included an article for you, Activating Prior Knowledge with English Language Learners on Edutopia, and you'll find it linked in your PDF. Brain research from Carnegie Mellon psychologists confirm that it's easier to learn something new when we can attach it to something we already know. And it's so important to think about how this applies to the multilingual learners in your setting. They need that actual connection in their brain so they can learn new content. Activating background knowledge or schema involves identifying what students already know through their backgrounds, their experiences, and knowledge, building on that existing knowledge as a bridge to new content. So we make learning both meaningful and accessible for them. And Melanie linked the article in the chat for you.
Considerations for activating and building background knowledge. Questions to ask when you're planning that'll help guide you in making those instructional tweaks are, what are the key concepts do students need to know and understand? And that'll help you be super intentional when you're presenting new ideas and then doing it in a way that is building context for students. What are the students' language proficiency levels? So there are specific and unique needs for newcomers as well as those of expanding or bridging students. And so being mindful of those pieces as well. And then, are there any culturally or linguistic references that English learners may not know, and vice versa in the target language? And so being mindful of that culturally and linguistically sustaining piece will help guide you through the planning of that. And then finally, what academic vocabulary is needed to understand the content? So just identifying that before you even jump in with the unit launch will help support you in creating strategic activities to support students. We have a great article here for you as well that will help expand the content as far as building and activating background knowledge. And it's here right in the chat for you.
Okay, so we're going to share two strategies today, and you may know them. The first is a see, hear, wonder, and there's a bit.ly, and I believe Melanie will add it to the chat as well. And then we're also going to highlight what has been at times been called a KWL chart. In GLAD, it's called an inquiry chart. We decided to call it a knowledge and curiosity chart to sort of stay away from specific programs. And so let's begin with the see, hear, wonder. So if you've never used it before, we recommend choosing a video. Most curricula has a video to launch a unit, but if you are teaching, let's say, a science lesson, you may want to either show the phenomena in a video or give students a sort of experience that would allow them to first indicate what they see. And so in this strategy, you begin by playing the video or whatever, or if you're demonstrating something, not talking about it. We want children to purely use their sight to identify either something they saw or noticed. Then you play the video again with sound, because this time we're going to give them the opportunity to hear and think about what they heard. And then the third time you replay the video with sound, encouraging students to view it with curiosity. And students can complete the third part, I wondered. Most teachers have found this to be very effective because rather than just playing the video and moving on, it gives students an opportunity to think about what they already know about the content that's coming and then to respond to it.
The second, or the third strategy rather, is the knowledge and curiosity chart. And really, that is a great tool to get conversations going and level setting what students are about to learn about. So for the first step, you would select the next unit of study. You activate students' background knowledge, but by asking what they already know about the topic, and you record it in their exact language and words on the chart. And then once you have provided some context, like the video or a read aloud or something like that, you would then encourage students to share what they're curious about. So that would go on the other side of the chart. Maybe it's an extension of what you're learning. Maybe it's something that you've already planned, but whatever that is, that right side of the chart is going to be guiding you in selecting the activities and helping support and provide that context as far as curiosity, because we all know curiosity equals engagement and motivation in our classrooms. We have here what it would look like on the left in English and what it might look like on the right in Spanish.
And just to add on, because before I share the next strategy, these work well together. And so if you're launching the unit, it's perfectly fine to show the video and then begin the unit read aloud and then go back to what do you know about, or even show the video. What do you know about? Read something aloud, and then what are you curious about? But really the idea is to give students multiple opportunities to engage in conversation with each other. about what they already know about the topic. And then in strategy 4, continue with a double entry journal to connect to writing. So the idea is to leverage students' ideas and wonderings that you have modeled on the chart to support their writing. And in the double entry journal, as you introduce more content, students respond in their journals using the charts as a scaffold. And we both provided a bit.ly, and Melanie dropped it in the chat. And so we find that these work very well together. And what I typically do is at the beginning of a unit, I'll make journals for every student with many pages. The master that we gave you is in both English and in Spanish, so you would choose. And then whenever you think it's appropriate, whenever you want students to respond, you have them respond in those journals, and you can actually use it as an informal assessment because you'll see how students' ideas develop over time. Val, do you want to add anything about the double entry journal?
No, I think you did beautifully.
And all of the strategies that we've been calling out have an SLD on the far right corner. You can actually take this into designated Spanish language development or designated English language development by looking at students' writing, collecting them once a week, noticing what areas they might be categorizing them as assets and opportunities, and then with those opportunities, leveraging some small group time to call students back. So if, for example, they need extra support in punctuation, you'll see it in their writing. If they need extra support in capitalization, that points to that. Or sometimes we notice that as they're transitioning from one language to the other, some of the sounds aren't quite transferring. Like a lot of times when we see like the CH being used for with a what is it typically represented with, Mel? I'm trying to think, like chart, we see like a T, right? Like, so anyway, just looking at students writing, really thinking about what their needs are, seeing if there is a support, like there's a need for support with some of their understanding of sound letter correspondences or any concept of print, and then using that in a small group for designated SLD. Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I love how you brought up that articulation piece, just, if they're not articulating the word in English or Spanish correctly, then they need some systematic instruction on how to do that to help with their writing.
Yeah, so this one you get like the double benefit of the child is showing you what they know, and then you can use it as an informal assessment that can guide your instruction. Okay.
So we have another chat activity. If you could consider which of the following strategies would best support your students. So research has shown essentially that if you are committed to trying one strategy from professional development, you write it down and it'll more than likely happen. So we're asking you to consider any of these 4 strategies and write it in the chat, yes. However, it's even more effective if you have a sticky note near you or a notepad. If you are writing it next to you, then it becomes even more powerful. As you can see, these strategies don't take a lot of prep and planning, and they are highly effective. So, which strategy sung to you? Was it the predict react activity, the see hear wonder strategy, the knowledge and curiosity chart, or the double entry journal? And you can throw one of those in the chat, or if you'd like, if there's another strategy, you can certainly add that to the conversation. Or if you've had experience with one of these strategies, we welcome you to add that as well. So we'll pause for a minute and invite you to add your contributions to the chat. Terrific. Thank you, Janet. Yeah. So the biggest bang for your buck will be jotting it down on the sticky and trying it tomorrow and letting us know how it went.
So we're going to allow you to continue to add to the chat as we transition into cross-language connections. And we're beginning today with cross-language connections, or we're sort of moving on to cross-language connections because they're the foundation for building the bridge across languages. And so we want to sort of lean into this one. And then in our next session, we'll lean into language development, oral language development, and culturally and linguistically sustaining content woven through and how you can use that to bridge content for students. Okay, so it is critically important for us to leverage students' home language as an asset. Whether the home language is English or any other language, we really need to provide students with opportunities to share ideas with peers in the home language as they gain confidence expressing ideas in the target language. And we say this with a caveat that if you are delivering instruction in Spanish, it's really important to encourage students to speak Spanish, but we don't want to preclude them from engaging at all without giving them some sort of support so that they feel confident. Another really important consideration is providing text in the home language so students can engage above their current target language reading level. And so when we think about in many dual language programs, we have native English speakers and they're being provided with text to read in Spanish. One really effective strategy is to give them the book in their home language in advance so that when they need to read it, for example, in Spanish, that they have the context with which to understand it. And then today we'll look a little bit more at opportunities to make cross-language connections. And the best literacy instruction builds on what students already know.
Michelle will follow up at the very end and share some Project Arise resources that you can look into if you want to learn more. And this is one of them. We have some courses with some best practices there available for you. And they are based on the ELA, ELD framework. Just a few highlights to what we're already talking about in the 5 guiding questions. You'll note, make cross-language connections is critical, and that comes directly from the framework. Teaching novel sounds, letter patterns, and spelling patterns explicitly and connecting to the home language as well. Visual cues is critical, and that's for students all students really. Scaffolded opportunities to respond and meaning making.
And so just to sort of bring the brain research full circle, it's really remembering that the brain compares new information to what is already known. If it's found, a connection is made. If it's not found, the brain treats it like new information. So that constant comparison that's occurring in the brain is something that we can leverage to help students become more proficient in the target language.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about cross-language connections. We're going to focus on chance to leverage cross-language connections. And we're going to talk a little bit about contrastive analysis to identify that critical piece of the similarities and differences between the home language and the target language of instruction. So let's move forward with that. There are 4 different cross-language transfer types, and we like to share this slide as a way to use it more like a teacher superpower, where you can access the 4 types of transfer embedded within your lessons to create that thumbs up or thumbs down in your students' brains. So the first is positive transfer, and that is what students know in their L1 completely transfers. And that's the power of cognates. For example, numero and number really unlocks a lot of comprehension if we're using cognates. The second is that partial transfer. For example, in punctuation, you can have, in Spanish, if you have an exclamation, you have the inverted exclamation point. Oh, you have an inverted exclamation point at the beginning of the sentence, and then an exclamation point at the end. And that can support students in having that conversation. Oh, let me make sure that here we are. Okay, so highlighting those pieces could really support that transfer for students. You have negative transfer, which needs to be elevated also into the conversation. There are things in the 2 languages that don't transfer and in fact can cause some confusion. So highlighting those is critical when teaching students language acquisition. So for example, in Spanish, dime means tell me, and in English, that means a dime, like the 10-cent coin. And then finally, that zero transfer. Students need to know when they're learning Spanish that there are just some things that don't transfer. And so one of those things could be accent marks in Spanish don't transfer to English, and possessive and contractions with apostrophe S don't translate in Spanish. So it's not that we're asking you to avoid the zero or the negative transfer. We want you to talk about all of these types of transfer. They are equally important, and they all unlock so many strands of comprehension between the 2 languages for your students.
So our 5th strategy is phonemic analysis. And there is another resource that we'll share with you, but we found that ChatGPT is frankly the easiest way to conduct a phonemic analysis, because it will help you determine sounds that are the same in both languages, sounds that do not exist in the student's native language and therefore may cause difficulty. We provided you with this Venn diagram that you can use. And it's not that you have to do phonemic analysis for every letter in the languages right away. It's more that you can pause when you're going to begin your phonics lesson and make sure that all the letters in the words that you are going to be practicing exist in the other language. So we had looked at an example like said, and AI says in that word. Well, that doesn't exist in Spanish. So if that's what you're doing, then you need to make sure that you teach it. Or the other way would be true as well. So if you are teaching Spanish, you want to make sure that if you're introducing a word with the ñ or a word with any sort of digraph combination that doesn't exist in English, that you really stop and teach children. Like in the word llama, in Spanish, we know that we would say llama. And so we really need to think about just really considering what a student's needs might be, because if the sounds don't exist in the other language, we need to make sure we call them out explicitly. Do you want to add anything, Mel?
No, thank you.
Okay.
But I will say, I want to talk a little bit about phonemic analysis and how critical it is, especially with vowels. So we have the Venn diagram between Spanish and English. Of course, this could be done with any language, and it's a great example of partial transfer. But just investigating this skill a little bit further. In Spanish, each vowel always makes the same sound. So there are 5 vowels and there are 5 sounds. In English, it's a little bit more complicated. I like to joke that we can't even decide how many vowel sounds we have. The research says 14 to 25. So let's start there. And English is a morphophonemic language. And so the phonological patterns within English are certainly an influence, but the morphological patterns, the meanings and the chunks of the words are based on Latin roots, are based on history, and those trump the phonemes in English. And so it's critical for students to understand that that's a huge difference. And so when there is a word or a group of words that are not typically vowel sounds, like either a long or a short vowel sound in English, that needs to be highlighted, and students love to learn why. So that also can be accessed through Chat GPT. I find I use that in asking questions about why is it pronounced this way or why is it spelled that way? And that chat device tells me, and it's super interesting for the kids.
Melanie, will you please put the article in for the phonological
I
analysis?
will, yes.
Thank you. Okay, and then there's another resource called mylanguages.org. If there's anybody who really wants me to open it, please say so in the chat. But basically, we were looking for code that makes the equivalent sound of d as in dog. And in Arabic, Russian, and Vietnamese, the symbols that you see on the screen are the code that make that equivalent sound. And so if you have a Russian newcomer or a Vietnamese newcomer or an Arabic speaking newcomer, these are just amazing ways for you to show them what's coming. And even we know that it's making the same sound in English and in Spanish. And so it's just really good information for you to have as you have other children speaking other languages in our programs. And I don't see anyone who wants to open it, so I'm going to move on, but we're happy to show this to you if you ever want to see it.
So the next topic of cross-language connections we are going to highlight is identifying and using cognates. Cognates are high leverage tools in your toolbox that you can use to connect the multiple languages that your students represent. And we're going to show you how to do that through chants. So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
When we think about cognates, this goes both ways, right? So 30 to 40% of all words in Spanish have a related word in English. And sorry, for Spanish speaking English learners, cognates bridge the two languages. As students move up in the grade levels, we can highlight more sophisticated cognates that have multiple meanings in both languages. So in Spanish and English, capital or capital refers to the capital city. But in English, capital also refers to capital letters. And it's important to warn students they might run into false cognates, and they're words that look alike but don't have the same meaning in both languages. So éxito means success and exit means to leave. There are more words that are related than not. It's just important to make sure that you call that out. And students actually have a lot of fun finding false cognates. And if they're asking for a word in another language, again, ChatGPT can help. So for example, you can ask, éxito tiene un cognado en inglés, and then, or, does exit have a cognate in Spanish, or whichever way you're teaching, and that way you can help leverage that for students.
So just to dig a little bit deeper on what Monica was saying about ChatGPT, There are some false cognates out there, and they look very much alike, but we have to be careful in supporting students to understand if there are differences. So for example, rope and ropa could be compared or confused as a cognate, but it is a false cognate. And we recommend that you highlight those as well. Don't hide them. Put them up on the wall, put them in a digital slide deck, and students will love to contribute and add those to the chart and identify them on their own. And this is the example we asked the Chat GPT. We asked, are rope and ropa cognates? And that was the answer. No, rope and ropa are not cognates, and then it describes the definition of each.
So the next thing we wanted to share with you are some chants. And chants are an amazing way to make cross-language connections. We're not suggesting that we show both languages. Instead, we're just showing both languages. So if you are teaching in a language other than Spanish, you can access them both. Can you add in the chat, is there anyone who is teaching in a language other than Spanish? Just so I have a sense before we start digging in a little bit deeper into this section. And so the first example is a cognates chant for K2, which we'll share a little bit more in a moment. And then the second example is a chant that you can use with ChatGPT. El canto de los cognados, the one for K2, and I'm just going to chant it for you because I want you to see that the cadence is very, very simple. Cognados, cognados, identifico los cognados. Cognados son palabras que se ven similares, suenan similares y quieren decir lo mismo en inglés y en español. Cognados, cognados, identifico los cognados. How do you say it in English? Efficient. ¿Cómo se dice en español? Eficiente. The other example is just slightly more sophisticated language that can be used with students from 3rd grade truly all the way to 12th. And we provided the same chant in English. You can change where it says in Spanish to whatever language you're teaching in. I didn't see anyone add anything, so we'll just continue. Estrategia 6, crear un canto usando ChatGPT. So what we did was we used a benchmark and we used a 1st grade and a 4th grade unit. And I'll let Melanie explain on the next slide how we asked ChatGPT to create the chant.
So for the 1st grade chant, we are recommending, sometimes curricula have those chants available and sometimes they don't. Chants are critical to create that cross-language connection. So we're suggesting, in fact, we did a presentation last week and I did a screenshot of my phone because it literally took me 4 minutes and 36 seconds to create this chant. And for that small investment, there was a high leverage for students. So what you can do is you would go into the Chat GPT and you would enter the keywords, the genre, and the age group. For example, create a chant about the frog life cycle using tadpole and frog for 1st graders. So that was the original prompt that came about. If applicable, you can ask the Chat GPT to layer in some skills. So like, for example, a phonics skill would be create a chant about the frog life cycle using tadpole and frog using consonant blends. So you can layer on that piece too as well. You might need to repeat as necessary to view other options. Not in this chant, but in the chant you'll see in a few minutes, there was it wasn't inappropriate, but it just wasn't right. Or maybe it was this chant, but the word was dead. And we were thinking, we don't like that word so much. So we modified the chant to say, please take out the word dead and add it with a new word, and lovely Chat GPT fixed it for us. The last piece that you will need to do is you'll need to color code the sentences or stanzas, and that just helps for students' brain mapping. They can see the sentence syntax, they can know how to build their fluency through the repetition, knowing where the stanzas begin and end. And so this was the chant that was developed with that prompt that I just showed you. And there was even, it was to the tune of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, which I suppose you can add and request for your chant in the Chat GPT as well. I want to highlight those visual cues that would come after reading the chant to support that meaning-making piece. And I'm thinking purple. That's the purple part of the 5 guiding questions.
And if you're teaching in Spanish, you're going to want to choose a tune that ChatGPT can use in Spanish. So when I wrote chants, I often asked it to do it to the tune of De Colores, because it has sort of a nice rhythm, and my students really liked it.
Here is the same example for 4th grade in a different unit. So same principles, ask it. We added some vocabulary words. Chants are wonderful for introducing and building background knowledge for vocabulary and context. And that is what the Chat GPT developed for us.
So a way to extend this strategy is, if your stronger language is English, you can actually develop the chant in English first, and then you can copy and paste the chant from ChatGPT. Because it's used artificial intelligence to develop the chant, it actually translates better than if you write your own chant, put it in there, and tell it to translate it. So it will translate it into your desired language using Google Translate. And then again, you would color code. This was the translation of the chant that Melanie created in English in Spanish. And then we went as far as to have it change it to Russian. And because I'm bilingual in Russian, not in Russian, in Spanish, I'm able to go between the 2 languages and double check for meaning. But if you have learners who need to hear the chant in their own language, you can double check it with your Spanish if you're bilingual in Spanish.
And then if you put it into the Google Translate, it has to be Google Translate, not Google. You can actually play it back in that whatever language the text is by following these directions. You can actually slow down the cadence of the chant as well using those directions.
And so we're going to wrap up by setting the stage for the next session. And we're going to the Improving Education for Multilingual and English Learner Students and looking at practice 6. So the importance of integrating content with language and literacy development using content as a bridge across languages. So what gives meaning to our dual language programs is this understanding that content is what gives language meaning and purpose. And our students are developing proficiency in 2 languages and accessing knowledge and content in and through those 2 languages, or more for some students. So this means that we need to plan strategically for delivery of material in both of the program's languages and plan for how to use content as a bridge. So as we went through today, Melanie and I gave you the content in both languages, not because you're going to be translating from one language to another, but they're complementary to one another. And when used in tandem, they can help students to really begin to understand and bridge their 2 languages. So the bridge is a time where the heavy lift in Spanish is connected to English through an extension. So We do the heavy lift, the bulk of our instruction, then we make connections between the two languages, and then we extend into English to make sure that students' knowledge is transferring. So it's the moment in a dual language program where teachers bring the two languages together. So one way is in contrastive analysis, where we've given you some examples today. We're noticing the similarities and differences between the language. We're calling out those cognates. We're thinking about what is the same and what is different, and we're helping the students make those connections. The other way is to transfer that academic content and skills they have learned in one language to another language. So that bridging involves the use of cross-linguistic strategies that lead to the development of meta-linguistic awareness, where a student will read something and say, "Oh, I know what that is, porque en español es esto, and in English it's this." So if I know that the word, I don't know why I keep saying efficient, but if I know the word efficient in English, it will transfer to the word eficiente en español. We highly recommend Beeman and Neuro's book, Teaching for Biliteracy, if you don't have it, but you don't need it because they have this amazing website. If you haven't signed up for an account, we really highly recommend it. If you would like to do some homework, you can go on and look at some of the bridging resources. We weren't sure about grade levels, but if you create an account, you'll be able to access all the videos. There's kinder, first, second, and middle school. And we gave you a list of resources that we've used for the presentation we shared with you today. And I think Michelle's going to be coming back on, but we'd like for you to please give us feedback about today's workshop so we can make adjustments to part 2 if needed.
Thank you so much to Monica and Melanie for an amazing presentation today. Just so many great resources that can be put into action tomorrow in your classrooms. So thank you all for coming. As Monica said, if you could take our survey, give us some feedback for the next session, that would be great. You can scan the QR code or the bit.ly. Melanie, could you throw the bit.ly in the chat? I'm sorry, my chat disappeared when I shared my screen. Thank you. All right, and just as we're closing out today, a reminder that we have additional Project Arise offerings available to you, including our online courses that Melanie mentioned earlier. I'm putting the flyer link in the chat if you would like to check out those courses around executive function, the teaching of reading and writing, and then intensive intervention. We also have our next biliteracy instruction part 2 workshop coming up on February 27th. So make sure that you're registered for that. And with that, thank you all so much for joining us today. It was a real pleasure seeing you, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come learn a little bit about better supporting your students. And so we wish you a happy Friday and a happy weekend, and we will hopefully see you at our next session in February. Thank you all.